All right, so we're going to get started. And of course, we want to let you know about PATN's mission. The mission of the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network, or PATN, is to support the efforts and initiatives of the Bureau of Special Education and to build the capacity of local educational agencies to serve students who receive special education services. In PDE's commitment to the least restrictive environment, our goal for each child is to ensure IEP teams begin with the general education setting with the use of supplementary aids and services before considering a more restrictive environment. Okay, before we move forward, I want to orient you to our Padlet. That's where you're going to be able to find the materials for today. And I did put the link to the Padlet in the chat. So I want to give you an opportunity to just, if you'd like, actually, I'm going to encourage you to click on the link because you're definitely going to need to access the Padlet for several of our activities today. So I'm just going to give you a couple of seconds. I'll put the link back in the chat if someone joined after I posted that. Okay, so the Padlet will always be available to you even after the session. So if you wanted to favorite this page, you could definitely do that. So in the first column is the presentation for today in PDF form. So if you would like to follow along with the presentation, if you click on this first box, it will open up the presentation and you're able to scroll through as we are advancing slides. If you would like to download the materials, you can click this print version and you can print it out or download it. I'm sorry, the download is up here. You can download it here or you could print it out. If you wanted to open this into a new window, you would just click that icon and then you would have the slides in a brand new tab. I'm just going to use the back arrow to go back to the Padlet. The second column is materials for identification of significant disproportionality. And if I'm scrolling up at the top, there is a video that talks about the significant disproportionality dashboard, some patent publications regarding significant disproportionality and additional resources that we will take you through today. In the second column, there are resources to support the identification of special education students. So we have several resources, once again, that we will be referring to today, as well as additional resources that you can review after the session. We have resources to support placement in the least restrictive environment, resources for disciplinary practices, and then general resources related to equity, including our Equitable Practices Hub. This next column, we're going to be doing some activities where we're going to be doing risk ratio calculations and data review. So we will utilize materials in this section. And then finally, there's some contact information in the last column. So just as a reminder, when you are asked to come to the Padlet to access materials, you would just click on that box and it will open up those materials. And if you wanted to open them up in a new window, you would just click this button and you can have it a little bit bigger. And you can also download the materials if you like. Are there questions about the Padlet, or is anyone having difficulty accessing the Padlet before we get into the content? You can either use the chat or you should be able to unmute yourself if you had a question about the Padlet or the materials. Okay. Yes, you will have access to the Padlet as long as you have the link, and I will put the link in the chat again. So we will be updating the Padlet throughout the year. We will be offering 2 additional sessions focused on disproportionality later in the school year. So we will be updating with presentations for those and with additional materials. So if you're not able to attend those presentations, please make sure that you keep the link to the Padlet, and actually we'll put the video, the recording for today on the Padlet as well, if you would like to access the recording to this session. Yes, we will be giving the dates for those future sessions at the end of the presentation, and if with the presentation that's on the Padlet, if you go forward to the last slide, those dates are available as well. So I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Dennis, who's going to get us started this morning.
I want to share this screen. Here we go. And all right, so our objectives for today are to conduct an analysis of data to identify risk ratio and risk index. We're going to understand the definition and calculation of significant disproportionality. And we're going to identify practices and resources to address disproportionality. And the difference between disproportionality and significant disproportionality is an important one. And as we go through this morning, we'll be highlighting what that means. And so please bear in mind that we have to keep that in the forefront, that disproportionality and significant disproportionality are different. When we engage in this work, we rely on the work of Glenn Singleton and his colleagues at Courageous Conversations. And there's 4 agreements of the Courageous Conversation. Those are to stay engaged, speak your truth, experience discomfort, and expect and accept non-closure. So when we're talking about disproportionality and or significant disproportionality, it can be very emotionally charging. So we need to make sure that we are being brave with ourselves, being kind with ourselves, being brave and kind with our colleagues. And we do that by staying in the moment and staying engaged even when it becomes difficulty. We do that by speaking your own truth. And so when we talk about speaking your own truth, I can't talk about what Shonda's experience is or what Melissa's experiences are. I can only talk about my own experience and how I am impacted by something. It also means to speak your truth is to be honest, and be honest about yourself, your feelings, and your thoughts around the data that you're looking at. Know that you might experience discomfort. When we start to see the numbers that are associated with disproportionality, it can cause some discomfort and people may become defensive. So just know that you may experience this discomfort, lean into it, be brave, and swim in the discomfort for a while. And finally, accept and expect non-closure. Issues around disproportionality have been occurring forever. You're not going to solve it in one data meeting. So just know that you might not feel like you've reached closure or consensus on any particular issue or any particular strategy in the time of one meeting or even 2 meetings. All right. So moving on, what is equity in Pennsylvania? This is from Governor Wolf. As our schools and communities work hard to promote a climate of inclusion, I'm reminded of the principles our Commonwealth was founded on: tolerance, religious freedom, and justice. These are the values Pennsylvanians continue to embrace today. My administration is committed to creating a culture of inclusiveness at all schools, where students are made to feel welcome and valued, and will continue to work with schools and communities to help them create these supportive settings that celebrate diversity and teach the importance of respect for self and others. And then before we start jumping into the data, we just want to take a look at Pennsylvania's definition of equity. Every student has access to the educational resources and rigor they need at the right moment in their education across race, gender, ethnicity, language, disability, sexual orientation, family background, and/or family income. And this idea of being at the right moment stands out for me because it's something that we need to consider when we're looking at the data. It doesn't mean that a student's going to continually need a certain type of services or that we're going to continually have to provide tier 3 for a student. But what we need to look at is what's happening at that moment. And we're also going to be looking at the changes over time. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Now we're going to identify risk index and risk ratio. So when we're talking about risk index is a comparison within the group. So a way to help remember this is index has in it, and it's within the group. So you see the word in there. So if I'm looking at the risk index, I'm comparing a group to itself. So it would be the percentage of students who are identified as male, the percentage of students who are identified as Latino or Hispanic, who have received a certain outcome. Okay, so index is the percentage within the group. Risk ratio is a comparison between one group and another group. Okay, so I can take the risk ratio would be if I wanted to take all of the students who are identified as English language learners and compare them with the rest. I would have to take the risk index of the English language learners and compare it with the risk index for the total population without the English language learners. And so that will become more clear as we're going through, but just to get an idea of what those two terms mean. So before I go farther, in your Padlet, I have a little cheat sheet for you. Hopefully I have the Padlet here. Let's show you where this is. All right, over, come on. Huh. Interesting. My Padlet is not moving. Let's refresh here. Ah, there we go. Okay. Here, under risk ratio calculations, this risk index risk ratio, this is a cheat sheet worksheet that's going to provide all of the information that I'm going to provide over the next couple of slides in one sheet. Okay, so just so that you have that for your access. All right, so the percentage of a group that receives a particular outcome. So in the examples here, we're looking at the percentage of students who receive one or more out-of-school suspensions. Okay. What we're measuring doesn't necessarily matter. Okay. I could be looking at the risk index of students who are in honors classes. I could be looking at the risk index for students who are receiving tier 3 services, the risk index for students who are enrolled in special education. The outcome doesn't matter. It does matter in the long run, but what we're focusing on here is that we're really just looking at how to calculate risk index. So if I take a look here at the students who are Black, okay, the number of students who are enrolled is 212. The number of students who are Black and who have received one or more out-of-school suspensions is 98. So I take my 98 and I divide it by 212, which is the total number of students who are Black in the school, and I come up with 0.46. So 46% of the students who are Black have received one or more out-of-school suspensions. So their risk index is 0.46. When I take a look at the risk ratio, now I'm comparing the risk index of one group to the risk index of the whole group minus the group that I'm looking at. So in this example, if we wanted to stick with looking at the risk ratio for students who are Black, okay, I'm going to subtract the comparison group from the whole group. So I have 508 students in the school who are not identified as Black, right? I take my 720 and I subtract 212 and I get 508. That's how I came up with that number. 720 total students, take out the students who are in the comparison group, 212, and I come up with 508. Then I'm going to subtract the comparison group with the outcome from the whole group with the outcome. So I have 227 students total who have received one or more out-of-school suspensions. 98 of those students are Black. So I'm going to take my 227 minus 98, and I get 129. Now I can calculate the risk index for all of the students except for the students who are Black. So I take my 129, and I divide it by my 508, because 129 was the number of students who are not Black who have received an out-of-school suspension. 508 is the total number of students who are not Black in the school, and I get a risk index of 0.25. To get the risk ratio, now I'm going to divide the risk index of the comparison group by the risk index of the group outside of the comparison group. So my risk index for students who are Black was 0.46. Risk index for all other students is 0.25. When I take 0.46 and divide it by 0.25, I calculate that to be 1.84. Whoop. There it is. Okay. So what does that mean? That means that students who are Black are 84% more likely than all other students combined to receive an out-of-school suspension. Apparently, I didn't check my animations. There we go. So when we look at risk ratio, okay, it's the risk of one group compared to the risk of all other students. It's the best single measurement to summarize a group's risk. But what do the numbers actually mean? If the risk ratio comes out to be 1, that means it's an equal risk. Because if my denominator and my numerator are the same, I'm going to get a quotient of 1. That means the risk is exactly the same. So we're not looking for 0, we're looking for the risk ratio to be the same. If I calculate a risk ratio of 1.25, that means the student is 25% more likely, or students in that group are 25% more likely to receive that outcome that we are measuring than all other students. On the opposite side of that, if I calculate a 0.5, that means the students are only 50% as likely to receive that outcome that we're measuring compared to all other students.
You're good.
Okay. Oop, I hit the wrong one. Okay. So when calculating the risk index for all students receiving the outcome examined in the examples, so that meant that we were taking a look at the let me pull it up. This is when it's going to become challenging to bounce back and forth between two. So that would have been taking the 120 and dividing it by 500. And that would have calculated your risk index for all students. And how does the risk index for all students compare to the risk indices for subgroups? So if you calculated that risk index, then you were able to compare that risk index of all students with all of the other students. And of course, I don't have my answer sheet right by me. So, but fortunately, I have my handy dandy calculator. And that risk index turns out to be wrong. 20 divided by 500 is 0.24. So think if we were looking at all of the risk indices for all of the groups, okay, so 0.24, I'm looking at the risk of selected subgroups. So the risk index of 0.24 for all students is lower than most of the risk indices for the other students, with the exception of Asian students and students who are Native American or Alaska Native. All right. I want to jump to these two questions. Well, let's take a look at this question, actually. For what reason might underrepresentation for an outcome be of concern? Okay. So not necessarily in this example, because I think this was looking at disciplinary referrals, right? So underrepresentation could be a problem when we're looking at it from office discipline referrals. But in general speaking, what could be some problems with having underrepresentation for an outcome? And I'll again ask for some brave souls who would like to unmute and say, I think it's this.
I was
Is it Ian or Ian?
Ian. I mean, I think in our group, we talked a little bit about special education, that it could be indicative of a child find issue. So that might be an issue, like we might need to clean up with respect to child find and making sure that we are successfully discovering students with disabilities in a timely fashion.
Excellent, thank you. And I see Kristen has typed into the chat underrepresentation in gifted. Yep, could be lack of services for a subgroup, right? Okay. So this idea of underrepresentation is important for us to take a look at as well. One of the things that we need to keep in mind that the data is the data, and we can't necessarily understand what's causing it until we do the root cause analysis. So Shonda's going to be taking you through that later on, but oftentimes when we look at the data, we want to jump to solutions or jump to reasons why. And so we have to be really cautious about doing that. And that will also bring into mind the whole idea of the 4 agreements of courageous conversations. Because when we jump to causes and reasons by just taking a quick look at the data, we can jump to assumptions that might not necessarily be true. Any other thoughts? Did anybody get to writing a problem statement based on the data that you analyzed? I'm going to interpret your silence as a no. But the reason that we wanted to go through this is it's not going to be on the final exam. You're not going to be asked to calculate these things. This spreadsheet does it for you. But we wanted you to have an understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about risk index and risk ratio, and what those 2 calculations mean and how they are important in looking at disproportionality. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop share and turn this over to Melissa, who's going to start talking about the next section on significant disproportionality.
All right. Thanks for coming back. We are going to be talking more specifically about significant disproportionality in this section, and we'll be addressing our second objective, which is to understand the definition and calculation of significant disproportionality. So these are one of the terms that Dennis had you rate yourself on the beginning. Remember that scale from 1 to expert, and there's an important distinction from disproportionality that we were talking about before and significant disproportionality. So disproportionality is what we talked about in the first section. So that's when a group receives an outcome at a greater or lesser rate than other groups. So that's what you were talking about in your breakout rooms and with those calculations. So this could be a pattern of over or underrepresentation of a subgroup. And that's what we are now shifting into significant disproportionality. And I did see some questions in the chat earlier, so that was perfect segue. Thank you for asking those. So this significant disproportionality in this section is when the rate of the difference of the outcome reaches a threshold to warrant examination of significant disproportionality in identification, placement, or discipline. So we'll talk about those thresholds too, but it's also important to know that this section specifically about significant disproportionality as it relates to special education as defined by the Bureau of Special Education. So we're going to talk all about that specifically in this section. So IDEA Section 618D, if you would like to know specifically, requires states to collect and examine their data to determine if significant disproportionality based on race and ethnicity is occurring in the state and the local education agencies, so we say LEAs of the state, with respect to the identification of children as children with disabilities, including the identification of children with disabilities in accordance with a particular impairment, the placement in a particular educational setting of those children, and then the incident duration and type of discipline. There we go. Pennsylvania uses risk ratio analysis. So you talked about the risk ratio analysis when you were talking about disproportionality. We're using that risk ratio analysis that you're familiar with to identify whether the LEA has significant disproportionality. Remember, this is as related to special education. So as you recall, that risk ratio is a numeral comparison, and it's expressed as a ratio or decimal. We were talking about that in that continuum chart that Dennis showed, that compares the risk of one group to the risk of another group. So the standard methodology identifies disparities across 7 racial and ethnic groups in 14 categories of analysis. Sorry, I'm freezing up here. So an LEA is identified with significant disproportionality when the risk ratio of any of the analyzed categories exceeds the established thresholds. And that's what we will talk more about in just one second. There we go. Okay. So what is analyzed? The identification of children with disabilities, including identification of specific disabilities. So these would include intellectual disabilities, specific learning disabilities, emotional disturbance, speech or language impairments, other health impairments, and autism. Also, placement. So we're looking at placement of students with disabilities inside the general education classroom for less than 40% of the day, also separate schools and residential facilities. Discipline of students with disabilities, looking at out of school suspensions and expulsions of 10 days or fewer, out of school suspensions and expulsions of more than 10 days, in school suspensions of 10 days or fewer, and in-school suspensions of more than 10 days. Also, disciplinary removals in total, including in-school and out-of-school suspensions, expulsions, and removal by school personnel. So these are the ratios that we have been talking about. So if you recall in that definition of significant disproportionality, we're looking at when the rate of those differences of outcomes reach a threshold to warrant an examination of practices. So these are the established risk ratios over which significant disproportionality based on race or ethnicity is significant. So these are based on stakeholder input. So these you don't have to worry about calculating them. You just have to know what they are because they were already established. So Pennsylvania has established these thresholds so you can see, remember, equal risk was 1, right? So identification 3.0, placement 3.0, and discipline 2.5. Those are the established thresholds. So also important to note are these minimum sizes for analysis. And these were also already established by stakeholders for significant disproportionality. So the minimum analysis, the cell size, so this would be 10 for the first one. This was that numerator when you were doing the calculations. So this is the minimum number of children experiencing a particular outcome. And again, that's used as the numerator when calculating either the risk for a particular racial or ethnic group or the risk for children in all other racial or ethnic groups. So that has to be 10. And then the N size 30, that was the denominator. So that's the minimum number of children enrolled in an LEA with respect to identification and the minimum number of children with disabilities enrolled in an LEA with respect to placement and discipline. And that's used as the denominator when calculating either the risk for a particular racial or ethnic group or the risk for children in all other racial or ethnic groups. If there are not 10 and 30 in the initial group, they're just not analyzed in this method, and that calculation would just be eliminated. Then for the comparison group, if there aren't 10 and 30, the state numbers are used. You do not have to calculate this yourself. There is a dashboard that does that for you. And this is a screenshot of that dashboard. If you're looking at our Padlet, it's on there. There's a YouTube video. So you'll see this screen, and then you'll see a person in the front there that will walk you through. So superintendents were all mailed, everyone across the state, the superintendents were mailed this letter last spring. And it's the login information. So you would have to reach out to your superintendent if you would like to access this, which we highly recommend, but that's who has your login information. So again, we've linked that YouTube video on our Padlet that can walk you through how to navigate the site to access your district data. Also, this presentation is on the Padlet. So if you're looking back, or maybe you're watching the recording, you can also click that link right there and it'll take you there. So it's the same thing, just in two ways. If you're looking for that information, we just thought that would be nice for you to have it two easy to look for ways, but it is the same video. So the first row, as you can see, this is labeled for identification. The second row is placement, and the third row is discipline. So a green check in the category indicates that the LEA is not flagged. So that means the risk ratio did not exceed the threshold for 3 consecutive years. The yellow check, you can see a yellow check there, that indicates that it's a warning status. So the risk ratio in this category was above the threshold in the 2 most recent years. So that would be like a warning. And then a red X means that the risk ratio in that category exceeded the threshold for 3 consecutive years. So I also want to show you these gray dashes. That just means that no risk ratio calculation was performed in that category. And that's just like we talked about those minimum sizes. It would just mean that there just were not enough in that category to meet that minimum cell size. So again, reach out to your superintendent for your login information. We unfortunately don't have that. And actually Patton and IUs don't have that information at all. It's down to district level. So you would need to reach out to them. If you have any questions, or even if you contact the superintendent and they have questions, they can contact Dan or Jody, and their contact information is in that last column on the Padlet when Shonda walked you through that. If you just scroll the whole way over, that's the contact information there, and they can help you with login or any other more specific questions about the dashboard. So the identification of significant disproportionality means that the risk ratio exceeds that established threshold in 1 or more analyzed categories for 3 consecutive years, just like that dashboard defined with those, the X's. This would be that red X as you're looking at your data. So also, despite having a risk ratio in excess of the threshold for 3 consecutive years, an LEA may not be identified with significant disproportionality if they demonstrate reasonable progress in reducing the risk ratio. So reasonable progress is defined by a reduction of the risk ratio of 0.25 or greater for 2 consecutive years. So that's how you're showing improvement. So we want to help you examine your data, and we encourage you to be proactive. Even if you're not being identified with significant disproportionality, if you log on to your dashboard and access your information and have those teaming meetings and just be proactive with your data, then that's like really a nice tool for you, because again, you don't have to calculate it. It's done for you. It shows you all of the categories, your risk ratio, even when you're in a warning. So we highly encourage you to do that. Next, I'm going to hand it over to Shonda, who will introduce some practices and resources that you can use to address disproportionality.
Hey, before we move forward, are there any questions? And you can feel free to use the chat or unmute. Okay, because I know there were a couple of questions earlier about the thresholds that are being utilized. Okay, so just to reiterate, Melissa's point is that when we're saying, using the terminology significant disproportionality, we are referring specifically to the calculations for the special education population in those specific categories with those thresholds that have been determined via the state. And when we're using the terminology disproportionality, we're talking about all students and disaggregating data for all students in multiple categories. So I wanted to make that clear because I'm going to kind of be switching between two of those in this section. And please feel free to, if you have a question, to just put it in the chat. I am monitoring it, and I want to make sure that there's clarity and that, you know, we have opportunities to respond to questions in real time. Okay, so, and Melissa did just put the link to the Padlet back in the chat because we are going to be using that in a little bit. So if you are identified by the state as far as significant disproportionality, and remember that means you're exceeding the threshold for at least 3 years in one or more of those categories, the LEA must review its policies and procedures and practices to ensure that they are complying with Chapter 14 IDA in its identification of students, its placement of students, et cetera. So that's the first thing that must occur. Secondly, any revisions to policies, practices, and procedures that occur after that review must be publicly reported by the LEA. And then finally, 15% of IDEA Part B, 611 and 619 allocations should be set aside and used for comprehensive, coordinated, early intervening services. So those are the 3 things that must happen if LEA is identified for significant disproportionality. And this is something that occurs over several years. The expectation isn't that all 3 of these things will occur in the same year. You are provided with time to review those policies, to publicly report any revisions, and to set aside those funds and utilize those funds to kind of mitigate significant disproportionality within your LEA. There are 2 documents on the Padlet that provides additional support for you on these 2 tasks if you were identified or if you had more questions. So looking at the Padlet in the second column under identification of significant disproportionality, the first box has that YouTube video that talks specifically about the dashboard. The second one is a publication that really goes through that definition of significant disproportionality, along with the categories that are looked at in regards to special education, how it's calculated, and the thresholds. So that's a valuable document for you. And then the third document is the comprehensive coordinated early intervening services. So it talks about what LEAs must do with their funding and what they can do with those funds. So I would recommend that you spend some time with those 2 publications. So additionally, in terms of utilizing those funds, there are recommendations within that document as far as other tasks that you could engage in beyond looking at policies, practices, and procedures. So Catherine asked a question, does the school have the 15% of money flagged every year until the problem is resolved, or is it just 1 year? I would refer you to the document. I don't want to give you incorrect information, but from what I saw is that you have the 15% flagged, then you are given the exact amount of money that should be utilized to mitigate significant disproportionality. And then you have a year to utilize that money for those activities, like professional learning, implementing an MTSS program. There's specific tasks that you could choose to utilize that's in that third document on the Padlet. For specific questions regarding finances and money, I would refer you to Del Hart, and his contact information is on the last column of the Padlet. So what we're hoping is that before you get to an instance where your LEA might be flagged for significant disproportionality, we're really encouraging you to start the process of disaggregating data so that you can identify if groups of students are being over or underrepresented in various categories, not just identification for special education or LRE or discipline. We want you to really start having a global viewpoint of how students are experiencing school as a whole group and through the disaggregation of data. So how can we address educational inequities? So we can do that by self-awareness, through data practices, which we're going to talk about today, thinking about family and community engagement practices, considering academic equity, and considering disciplinary equity. So why should we be using data? So we did have that opportunity to practice with risk indices and risk ratios a little bit earlier. And in our samples, we did see that there were subgroups of students in that sample who were being overrepresented in terms of discipline. So we can use data to disaggregate achievement data, disaggregate discipline data, et cetera, in order to calculate those risk ratios. We can use it as a way to identify what specific problems we might have in our organization and then engage in that process of root cause analysis. We can use it to recognize things such as disproportionate representation in AP courses or special education. Earlier, when Dennis said, why should we be concerned about underrepresentation? In the chat, someone said underrepresentation in giftedness, identification for giftedness. And that's definitely something that we could disaggregate data to determine, are there certain subgroups within our LEA that's being underrepresented for giftedness? You could use this to identify, are there families that aren't being present at PTO events or are not being involved within the school? Are those families having issues with access? So we could determine that through the disaggregation of data into subgroups for families as well. So these disproportionality markers are symptoms that can reveal an underlying cultural mismatch that might be present in a school. So that's some of the reasons we think about why should we be spending this time looking at our data and specifically disaggregating data. So I just wanted to give us the opportunity to utilize the chat. So what is your current experience or practice disaggregating data for subgroups? So in the chat, I'm going to give you a few seconds to type. Are you currently, is this a practice that you are currently engaged in that's intentional? Is it something maybe you do once or twice, or something you might look at the data, but you feel like you want to go further? So what's your experience right now with disaggregating data for subgroups? And I'll just give us a few moments to type in the chat, or if you want to, like Dennis says, be brave and unmute, you can do that as well.
In our district in State College, we are moving to a single student information system so that we can regularly review the data. We found in investigating our disproportionality that we couldn't compare easily across the systems, and buildings were operating in silos. And so we were only seeing a few incidents in each building, which didn't amount to an alarming number until we put all of the numbers together and got the larger view. And so to remedy that, we're moving to this single system that will generate the reports and the disaggregated data so that we can review that multiple times per year.
That's great, Catherine. So you're talking about at that micro level, you weren't seeing the disproportionality, but when you were looking at more of a macro level across the district, you were able to, when you're disaggregating by subgroups, seeing that there definitely was a pattern or subgroups of students who maybe were overrepresented or underrepresented in specific categories. That's
Correct.
great. What can you say? What system are you all adopting?
Synergy.
Synergy. Is anyone else using Synergy out there? Okay, I'm seeing have experience doing this for student achievement, grades, attendance, discipline. They also have an equitable practices committee that looks at this as well as administration and teachers. That's great, Catherine. Can you share how often are you all engaging in those practices?
Sure. We meet as an equitable practices committee probably quarterly. I guess you could look at that. We have meetings in between, but we're not necessarily pulling that data. As principals and central office staff, which I am, we typically pull it in and around quarterly. However, discipline data we look at more frequently, about once a month, because I have to pull special education data. And we also have diagnostic assessments going on after COVID, attendance issues. So right now we're looking at that granularly, which is about monthly, where the other things are a bigger picture.
Yeah, that makes sense because that discipline data is constantly changing, et cetera. So thank you for sharing those practices. Melissa is saying that they typically do review their data, their special ed suspension data monthly, but weren't previously disaggregating data by subgroup. Okay, that's good to know. So, we had the opportunity to practice looking at disaggregated data by subgroup a little bit earlier. And we're going to talk a little bit about some things we need to consider as we're looking at those data. So thank you all for sharing out. So we want to think about what are some of those contributing factors to disproportionality? So before I kind of talk to you about what the literature says, just in the chat, what are some things that you think just from your experience as educators, working within various districts, what do you believe contributes to disproportionality? What might be some contributing factors? Why might we see groups being overrepresented or underrepresented within our data? And you can just utilize the chat. We'll share out some of those ideas. Okay, in the chat, we're seeing implicit bias, definitely. Current belief systems. Unfamiliarity with cultural norms. So that's an example of cultural dissonance. Vague discipline terms. Yeah, so thinking about how some of our policies might be written, discipline or code of conduct. So is that written in an equitable manner? Internal procedures, lack of trauma-informed care or restorative practice. So how are we preventing and how are we responding to students? Absolutely. So when we are thinking about disproportionality, it is complex. And I just want to refer you, there is a great document on the Padlet that is where this information comes from. It's through NYU. And the name of the document is Identifying the Root Causes of Disproportionality. And I believe it's in the second column. It's a wonderful publication. So when we're thinking about disproportionality and all of those possible contributing factors, we want to think about systems and how they can interact to affect disproportionality. Disproportionality has no one cause, but it's rather the product of a confluence of contributing factors. And these factors provide the conditions and environment in which disproportionate outcomes can occur. So consider a culturally responsive educational systems approach. This approach critically assesses the intersections between policies, practices, and people as they deliver educational services to all students, and considers how these intersections affect disparate outcomes in special education for students who have not been identified. So we want to think about how these intersections can affect disparate outcomes for students. Culturally responsive practices require practitioners to develop a nuanced, reflective, and critical social consciousness and cultural competence about race, power, and privilege in society. So when in the chat, when we were talking about what do you think might be some contributing factors to disproportionality, some of you talked about implicit bias, current belief systems, unfamiliarity with cultural norms. So I think you are hitting the nail right on the head. So these practices do make up a culturally responsive lens through which deficit-oriented beliefs and approaches to educating students are challenged through systems, policies, and people. So using a culturally responsive lens implies that students can excel in academic endeavors. So when we're thinking about culture and equity, we want to think about that intersectionality between the people, the practices, and the policies. And you all kind of hit upon this when we were talking about contributing factors in the chat. So addressing equity works best as a multi-component approach that's embedded within your existing system. So school systems can either reflect a biased society or provide a protective buffer against it. To make it a protective place, teams should adopt a framework that is preventative, instructional, and flexible enough to be tailored to the strengths, needs, and values of its students, family, and community. So when I say that statement, I think immediately of a multi-tiered system of support, or MTSS. So MTSS for academics, for behavior, or that wonderful integrated model between the two. So that's what I think of when I think of a framework that is preventative, instructional, and flexible enough to be tailored to the strengths, needs, and values of its students, families, and community. So now let's just talk about this interrelatedness of people, practices, and policies. So consider instructional practices that use engaging instruction to reduce the opportunity gap. So racial disparities in academic achievement are commonly called an achievement gap. This label implies the challenge lies within the student when it really is a lack of opportunity for effective instruction causing the divide. It's more instructive to call this disparity the opportunity gap. Teams can ensure each student group has equitable access to engaging instruction by including these 4 components. So utilizing explicit instruction, building and priming background knowledge, increasing opportunities to respond, and providing performance feedback. So that's one way to think about the practices that we're engaging in. Now let's think about how policies can either hinder or support equity. In the chat, you all were referring to disciplinary or codes of conduct, and I think you were definitely on the right track, because we want to think about developing policies with accountability for disciplinary equity. Even policies that make no mention of race or ethnicity, such as zero tolerance discipline codes, can exacerbate inequities because of their impact on student-teacher interactions. Instead, administrators and policymakers should adopt policies with clear definitions. So someone talked about vague definitions for discipline terms. So definitely we want clear definitions and discipline procedures, and replacing harmful practices with instructional responses to unwanted behavior, and install accountability for improving outcomes for students. Then finally, let's think about how can individuals, so how can the people affect equity? So we want to teach strategies for neutralizing implicit bias in discipline decisions. So research increasingly shows, excuse me a minute, my screen just messed up, increasingly shows the influence of implicit bias on classroom and school discipline decisions. So there are specific strategies that educators could use to identify and neutralize their implicit biases before they affect decision-making, including the identification of vulnerable decision points, which are specific discipline situations that might be more prone to implicit bias, and then also learning strategies to help educators respond in line with their values or the values of the institution. So just a preview, earlier I said we were going to have 2 more sessions where we're talking about responding to disproportionality. And our 3rd session is going to specifically focus on the identification of vulnerable decision points and development of neutralizing routines. So Melissa, you're going to have to help me. Is that in March? Yes, it is in March. So that session will be in March, where we are specifically looking at that strategy of vulnerable VDPs and neutralizing routines. Thank you. March 22nd, 2022. Thanks, Kate. She put that in the chat. So I wanted to share this graphic with you because with equity, we want to think about culturally responsive practice. And becoming culturally responsive is a lifelong journey and not a final destination. And the journey does involve being intentional about choosing to stay engaged in introspection, embracing alternative truths, and ensuring that every student is successful. So this process is represented in the outer circle of this model. So we see this as having a will. So if we're thinking about many of you are administrators, do you have that desire to lead? Do you have that will, the desire to lead and to show a commitment to achieving equitable outcomes for all students? So once you have that will, next comes that feel. Are we choosing to engage in gaining cultural knowledge about ourselves and others? So we want to make sure that we're understanding, what are my viewpoints, what are my beliefs, and how is that affecting my practice? How is that affecting my interactions with others? In addition to gaining cultural knowledge. Earlier in the chat, someone said, you're not familiar with cultural norms. And with this unfamiliarity with cultural norms, there can come instances of cultural dissonance where there might be 2 different norms clashing, and the person in power, that classroom teacher, that administrator, when there's not an understanding of cultural norms, that might lead to misunderstanding and disciplinary practices that might not be warranted if there was more of an understanding of cultural knowledge. And then finally, once you have that will and that feel, you want to then utilize those skills that you've gained and apply that knowledge to lead the change by skillfully putting beliefs and learning into action. So you see these arrows illustrate the ongoing unfinished nature of that work. So we need to make sure that we are kind of refilling our bucket so that we can maintain that will, that we are engaging in those practices that are filling us up so that we can apply those skills continuously. The 8 areas in the inner circle describe actions of cultural responsiveness within the will, feel, and skill. For those just beginning this work, these areas can be used as steps in an inside-out process. So starting with knowledge of oneself first, learning about others next, and then moving to action. Those further along in their journey see these areas as recursive as they purposely seek out ways to deepen their beliefs, knowledge, and practice and impact over time. So whether you're beginning this journey or you're in the middle of this journey, we want to think about what's in your invisible backpack or your briefcase. So these are things that you kind of always have with you. So when I'm thinking about my backpack and who I am is multifaceted. So I can think of, describe myself. I am a Black woman who was raised in the South, who's now living in the North, who's, highly educated. I've been to graduate school. My predominant language is English. I have a strong background with education. So I'm thinking about all of these parts of my backpack that are part of myself. And luckily, I can bring most of those things with me anywhere, including to work. But if we think about what our students have in our backpack and think about our systems, are there things that we're asking them to leave at the door that may not be as valued within our education system? So one of the things that comes to mind is students whose first language is not English. I remember an instance when I was doing a walkthrough at an elementary school with the building administrator, and we were in a classroom, and there were two students who were speaking to each other in their native language. And the teacher stopped them and said, only English in this classroom. And I just felt this gut check, because those students were being asked to leave part of themselves at that classroom door. They weren't being accepted with their native language. They weren't being allowed to interact with their peers in the way that was most comfortable to them. So we need to think about, within our systems, are we asking students to leave parts of themselves at the door, and consider how does that then affect our ability to relate to our students, their ability to relate to our academic content, to respond to our policies and our practices. So as we're thinking about these culturally responsive systems that we want to develop, as we think about these equitable systems that we want to employ, consider the viewpoint of your families, the viewpoint of your students, and the viewpoint of your staff members, and make sure that we're including those voices as we are thinking about engaging in equitable practices. So let's think about the foundation. So we want to make sure that we're understanding that difference between equality and equity. So equity is when every student has what they need in order to succeed or to be able to access our organization and everything within it. So if you look at that first graphic under equality with the blackboard, we see that every student has been given the exact same thing. They've each been given this green block, this green box. So for the first student, he didn't even need that box. He was fine on his own. He's able to reach that blackboard. For the second student, okay, they can reach the blackboard, they're there. For the third student, that's not enough for them. They're there, but they're barely there. They're still straining to reach that blackboard. And for our final student, that's not enough for them. They're still not able to access what they need in order to participate. Then when we look at the other side regarding equity and thinking about the individual needs of those students, we're able to give them what they need. The second student, they're fine with that box. The third student, we needed to give them more in order for them to access. And for the final student, we gave them a laptop. We thought outside of the box, literally and figuratively, in order for them to access what they need to succeed. So we want to be mindful that we don't confuse those two terminology, equality and equity. So equity, looking at the slide, that's the right of all students to achieve at high levels. And we want to consider the idea of a cultural proficiency continuum, and considering where are we and where is our organization on this continuum. And we do that by understanding the difference between equality versus equity. And finally, through that disaggregation of data, because like one of you said earlier, we didn't know we had a problem when we were disaggregating data at that micro level. It took us doing it at a macro level to identify that there were subgroups of students and that we did have disproportionality within our organization. So let's talk a little bit about this cultural proficiency continuum and thinking about the fact that we might be moving and we will be moving up and down this continuum as we are on this journey. So let's start with the bottom and go to the top. So cultural destructiveness, that's when we're seeking to eliminate the cultures of others in all aspects. And this could be done at a macro level. We see this in the news when there's instances of genocides. We've seen that before, where we're just seeking to eliminate the culture of others in all aspects. And we see that a little bit when we're talking about that example of the teacher telling the student, you can't speak that language here. This is a milder example, but that's destructive to that student when that teacher is trying to eliminate that aspect of their culture. There's also cultural incapacity, so trivializing or stereotyping other cultures. I think we see that often through microaggressions that can occur on a daily basis. So trivializing and stereotyping other cultures. Then there is this instance of cultural blindness. So not noticing or acknowledging the culture of others and ignoring discrepant experiences. So earlier when Dennis was talking about the 4 agreements of cultural courageous conversations, and he was saying we have to understand that he can only understand the world through his viewpoint and his experiences. And so if I'm telling him my experiences, he has to respect that because we are going through the world with 2 different backpacks, and we have to acknowledge that others are having different experiences. There's this term that I've heard many times, I don't see color. And for the longest time, it would bother me, and I didn't know how to articulate why that bothered me. And I kind of had this aha moment that when you tell me you don't see color, you're telling me 2 things that you don't see me. And if you don't see color, that's implying that there's something wrong with color. Why wouldn't you want to see that? Why wouldn't you want to acknowledge that someone might have a different culture or different background? And why is that not okay? Why do we have to act like that doesn't exist? So that's cultural blindness. And then as we go upward on this ladder, cultural precompetence, increasing awareness, either moving in a constructive direction or faltering and stopping. So sometimes when we're moving on this journey, you have that will, you might be in the process of filling, learning about yourself, learning about others. And sometimes it might become too much and you stop or you falter. And that might be okay for a moment, but we want to push through and continue to have that will to continue to fill ourselves up with knowledge so that we can apply those skills. Up next, cultural competence. So aligning your personal values to be inclusive of cultures that are new or different and having healthy interactions. And then finally, cultural proficiency. So holding the vision for creating a socially just democracy, lifelong learning to serve all. So like we said, this is a journey and we might find ourselves moving up and down on this ladder as our context changes, as our viewpoints change, etc. So this is a journey. So as we move forward, I wanted us to think about those steps, because as we're looking at data, we need to kind of understand where are we on this ladder. Because if we're at the bottom of the ladder and we're in those systems of destructiveness or incapacity or blindness, how might that affect us if we are actually disaggregating the data and looking at data for subgroups? So if we're at the bottom of that ladder and we're looking at those data, how could that affect how we're interpreting the data? And think about it also, if you're more at the top of that ladder at pre-competence, competence, or proficiency, how could that affect how we are responding to the data that we're seeing? So there are these ideas of downward spiraling conversations and upward spiraling conversations. And we want to make sure that you are thinking about this when you are engaging in the process of looking at your data. So an upward spiraling conversation speaks to the last 3 points of the cultural proficiency continuum and is reflecting growing cultural competence as policies, practices, and behaviors move toward that ongoing reflection and assessment of cultural and its impact. So when you're engaging in upward spiraling conversations and you're looking at the data, and I'm looking at thinking of the example earlier, and we saw that male students, Black students, and students identified as receiving free and reduced lunch were being overrepresented in the discipline data. So if we are having upward spiral conversations, we won't be focused on within factors as possibilities as the cause for this. We might then be looking more at, so how are our policies affecting those subgroups of students in a way that makes them overrepresented for discipline? Or what in our practices are affecting these subgroups of students to the point that they're being overrepresented with discipline? So when we are at that higher level of the cultural proficiency continuum, when we are looking at data, that disaggregated data, we are more likely to engage in these upward spiraling conversations. Conversely, when we are at the lower end of that ladder, communication tends to be outward focused and blaming others for situations and circumstances. So those conversations are usually about them or those kids, those families, and how they need to change or eradicate certain cultural attributes in order to assimilate to the dominant culture or to receive outcomes similar to their peers. So with those downward spiraling conversations, we're not being that introspective and thinking about those alterable factors that we might have control over as educators. Instead of, we're more focused on those unalterable factors as blame for why certain groups of students are having a disparate outcome. So this is just an example of a downward and an upward spiraling conversation. So I want to just give you a moment to look at these two examples. So this is a team that's looking at data, and just take a note of how the downward spiraling conversation differs from the upward spiraling conversations. So I want to give you a moment to read both of those, and then use the chat to kind of compare the two. And you can also, of course, unmute and share your thoughts as well. So as you're reading through these examples or have read through the examples, please use the chat or feel free to unmute and talk about what are some different outcomes we might see if we engage in a downward spiral versus an upward spiral conversation, or when do you usually hear these types of conversations?
Hi, Sean, that's Todd. How are you? How are you?
I'm great. Thanks,
Good.
Todd. Thanks for unmuting.
Well, you know, I lasted 2 hours, so that's pretty much personal best for me for not talking out loud. I was looking at, I was reading through the conversations, and I thought your last question was an interesting one, like what might it mean? And I
Mhm.
wonder if part of the downward spiraling conversation is an underlying issue of, I just don't know what to do. And instead of just admitting, I don't know what to do right now, we just kind of find external thought or faults. And I thought the upward spiraling conversation was interesting because if you take out even the adjective of African American and Latino students, you can put in any category. So I think the structure of the conversation for the upward spiral is one you could use for problem solving with any kind of disparity. So again, I think maybe the downward spiral, part of the underlying reason I hear people, make excuses and find external fault because they are afraid to admit or out loud internally, I don't know what to do. And
Mhm.
sometimes, you have to start at 0 to move up to 1.
I think that's a really good point. And someone else put in the chat that they've heard downward spiraling conversations when teachers feel defensive. And I think that supports what you're saying, that sometimes when we don't know what to do, it is easier to blame it on these unalterable factors. And that kind of can let us know that maybe we need to engage in more professional learning, so that we can really have these robust, more upward spiraling conversations. Kristen said these conversations occur during most MTSS meetings, both upwards and downwards. Absolutely. Someone noted downward spiraling doesn't yield positive action. Absolutely. It kind of almost puts you at a hard stop with those downward spiraling conversations because you're focused on things that really we don't have any control over. So then what can we do? As opposed to the upward spiraling conversation, they're looking at additional data. They're considering, what did they say? Maybe we're not offering the right kind of support. Maybe these students don't have access to upper level courses. Those are things that you can definitely explore and respond to. Those are things that are within that group's control. Someone said, I hear upward spiraling conversations when teachers understand that they're being supported in determining these best practices. That is an excellent point. I think with upward spiraling conversations, we need to provide that support so that we can be vulnerable enough to engage in those conversations and also model the upward spiraling conversation in these groups. Yes, someone said go ahead.
No, I just want to emphasize that. I mean, especially the piece about being vulnerable, about saying, I don't know what to do about this. And so, and that can, when we don't know what to do about something, when we are educators, when we're problem solvers, if we're at an impasse, then it becomes easy to say, well, to put the blame on the folks who are being affected by it, right? So I can say it's these students, they just aren't doing this. Or we also hear this, the parents aren't da 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 da. And so we need to remember, like, what is it that we can do? What options can we do to explore supporting the students that are in our control? And that idea of leadership allowing for those conversations to happen and stopping those downward spiraling conversations, and really like creating the atmosphere to say, I don't know what to do, and to explore options, I think is really critical in supporting upward spiraling conversations.
Yeah, very good point. And thank you for this wonderful segue. I'm reading the chat, sorry. So one of the things in the chat, the recommendation for professional learning can also be a downward spiraling. So instead of being proactive in the moment, there's a tendency to hide behind more training instead of taking brave steps forward in the moment while simultaneously working towards professional learning. It isn't one or the other, taking action and professional learning. It should be both. I think that's a good point too, because we do need to respond to what our data are telling us. We can't wait. We can't wait for the speaker. We can't wait for the class. We need to, like in the upward spiraling conversation, what in our policies, what in our practices are supporting this disproportionate or this disparate outcome for students? And how do we respond to that? And like you said, in addition to, we might also need to increase skills for our staff. Thank you for that wonderful point. So here's a question, and you please don't put this in the chat. This is kind of for you. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how comfortable do you feel responding when you hear others making negative statements? So maybe they're at the bottom of that ladder towards individuals of a different ethnicity, race, gender, ability level, religion, sexual orientation, or gender identity than yourself. So you hear others maybe talking in a way that makes it clear they're kind of at the bottom of that ladder, or they're engaged in downward spiraling conversations. And this doesn't just have to be in the work setting. It could be in the community. It could be across your kitchen table. Thanksgiving is coming up. So it could be in any setting. So how comfortable do you feel? 1, very comfortable, or very uncomfortable. 5, very comfortable. And once again, don't put this in the chat. And then I want you to think about, are there factors that contribute to your level of comfort when responding to downward spiraling conversation or conversations that are negative towards other groups? And so you can put that in the chat. Are there factors that address your comfort level? And you can also unmute as always. So lack of experience, that could be definitely a contributing factor to level of comfort. Okay, Lisa said have your own background experiences could affect your level of comfort as well. Okay, starting with myself, my age as I span different generations, beliefs and attitudes, definitely. I would say for me, if the person is in some sort of power over me, so like a supervisor or even like an elder in my community, sometimes I'm less comfortable than if it's someone I would consider a peer when responding to that. I know for me that affects my comfort level. So fear of others' reactions. Yeah, so having it being uncomfortable trying to provide another viewpoint. Yes, professional settings versus personal settings. So sometimes people say professional versus personal, and I think it depends on the individual, which you feel more comfortable with. Because and sometimes I feel much more confident in professional settings, kind of responding to those statements than sometimes I do in personal settings, because there might be worry about kind of damaging a relationship that I value. But then again, if it's a great relationship, then why shouldn't I feel comfortable with responding to negative statements? Let's see, try to suggest they attempt to listen to others instead of reacting, being open and listening, trying to put down your initial defensiveness. Yes, it is something we all have to think about, and it can be tough, and we do know that. And there are some strategies that can be utilized. So I believe in being intentional about almost everything. I am a planner. Give me a tool and I will use it. So here are some basic strategies that you can utilize when responding to downward spiraling conversations, or if you're hearing bias in conversations. So the first one is interrupt. So you can speak up against every biased remark every time in the moment without exception. And I think that is really hard, but when we let people say things in front of them, in front of us, it's almost by not saying anything, you're giving permission or almost this implied agreement to what they're saying. So you want to think about what you'll say ahead of time so you're prepared to act instantly. So you might come up with some phrases. So you might say, I don't like words like that, or that phrase is hurtful. For me, I have a daughter with an intellectual disability. And so if I hear anyone using the R word, I'm right there. I know exactly what I'm going to say because I've practiced it lots of times. So that's no problem for me. So thinking about if you want to utilize interruption, you can do some little sentence starters or phrases that are kind of your go-to phrases. The second one is questioning. So ask a simple question to find out why the speaker made the comment and how you can best address the situation. So you could say something like, why do you say that? Or what do you mean by that phrase? Or my favorite one, tell me more. So it's kind of a way to stop them and really make them think about what they're saying in that moment. The third one is educate. So explain why a term or a phrase is offensive. Encourage the person to choose a different expression. Sometimes ignorance is at work or lack of exposure to a diverse population is the reason for the use of an offensive term or phrase. And try saying, do you know the history of that word? As ways to educate. So you might start with interrupting and then also utilize educating as a strategy. And then finally, echoing. If someone else if you're in a group or maybe you're at a meeting, it's me, Dennis, and Melissa, and Dennis speaks up, support that person. If someone else is already speaking up against bias or a downward spiraling conversation, thank them and reiterate their message, because one voice is a powerful start, but many voices together can create that change. So think about some of these strategies that you could employ to kind of break up those biased conversations, those downward spiraling conversations that I'm sure we hear more frequently than we would like. So how can we integrate cultural proficiency in that data process? So we've already kind of been touching on that. So on the left, there are stages of a data process, and on the right, ways that we can engage in cultural proficiency. So we want to start off with building that foundation. So that's when we think about that will and feel. So learning about cultural proficiency principles, establishing group norms, like we talked about having courageous conversations today, incorporating cultural proficiency into the vision of your school or program. So is that a shared belief that we even have, that we want an equitable organization? Identifying a student learning problem. So when we are looking at that disaggregated data, being aware of those upward versus downward spiraling conversations, and how are we going to plan to interrupt those downward spiraling conversations if they turn up. Include the, thinking about opportunity gaps, not talking about achievement gaps, but really focusing on it as in terms of opportunity. Verifying causes. So when we're thinking about root cause, we want to make sure that we aren't just talking about assumptions. We want to, focus on that data, thinking about those underlying causes, and then we want to test those, making sure we're utilizing research, utilizing those local data. And I just love that example of, I think it was Kristen who said, we were looking at the building level, we didn't see a problem, but when we looked at our district, we did. So gathering more data so that we can be accurate when we're thinking about causes. When we're thinking about generating solutions, reflecting on cultural proficiency as solutions are generated by asking these questions. Do our strategies address student populations most in need of our attention? I think sometimes we might be guilty of thinking about the middle. There's this really great video that talks about bowling and how when you shoot for that center pin, you often leave a split. So you have these two pins that are left at either side. And thinking educationally, that might be our high achievers who need to be, need enrichment, and it can be our low achievers who are struggling. But we're hitting those kiddos in the middle, and we are missing these two groups. So that's just one example. So do our strategies address student populations most in need of our attention? Are these solutions most likely to result in closing that opportunity gap? Do any of these strategies harm or neglect any group of students or teachers? So are we harming with the solution that we're choosing to employ? And would the students and their parents in our school agree with our solution? So that's something to think about. How would our students and parents feel about the solution that we're putting in place? And then finally, when we're thinking about implementation, monitoring, and achieving results, we want to make sure we're continuing to disaggregate that data as we're progress monitoring. So do we see certain groups of students who are responding to that solution and other groups of students who are not? And then we need to acknowledge individuals whose practices are becoming culturally proficient as well. So that's just an example of how we can consider cultural proficiency within this idea of a data process. And so thinking about this bridge between data and results is this process of collaborative inquiry, where we're thinking about leadership capacity. So distributing leadership and capacity by equipping teachers and administrators with the knowledge that they need and the skills that they need in order to meet the challenges of accountability with data. Building collaborative teams that include shared norms and value that's data driven. And that includes, all of the stakeholders that we need in order to look at those data and who have the area of expertise in order to problem solve. And kind of that gets back to when we were talking about downward spiraling conversations, and maybe part of that be because we don't know what to do. So we want to make sure that we have persons with expertise in those areas in regards to the data that we are reviewing. Looking at about frequent data use. So data is used to provide feedback for continuous improvement and to serve students with frequent and in-depth use by the school community. So we don't want to just look at data once at the beginning of the year and never disaggregate that data again. We want to make sure that we're being intentional and that we have a data review calendar set up so that we can be intentional about reviewing those data. Instructional improvement should be the focus of the conversation. The focus is on what is taught, how it is being taught, and how it's being assessed, instead of we're shifting that focus from blaming students, their circumstances, other teachers, or factors that are out of their control. So ultimately, we are nurturing this collaborative culture that's based on a commitment to equity and trust. So one data protocol that we recommend using is team-initiated problem solving. So in the chat, is there anyone using the TIPS model or who have received TIPS training within their LEA? Just a yes or no. Negatives, no's, yeses. So TIPS is an evidence-based decision-making process. And it has both meeting foundations to have effective and efficient meetings, but it also takes, yes, your PBIS person probably has had TIPS training, Todd. But the TIPS process has data at the center, and it really takes teams through a data protocol that starts with problem identification, goal setting, solution development, a plan for monitoring fidelity, a plan for monitoring progress, and then evaluation. And it is a cyclical process, and at the center is data. So in our second session, which is in January, I know it's in January, we will be focusing on data practices, and we will spend more time talking about the TIPS protocol. It will not be considered a full TIPS training, but it will give you some more understanding about the TIPS protocol. And you could reach out to your local IU. We are training most of our PBIS facilitators within this TIPS framework. So this would be a great option for teams if you haven't adopted a data protocol. So one of the first steps within the TIPS data protocol is problem identification. And we did a little bit of that earlier when we were looking at the risk indices and risk ratios. So we utilize data to answer these questions. So when we're looking at behavioral issues, so maybe discipline, we want to answer all of these questions. So who's having the problem? What is the problem? When is it occurring? Where is it occurring? And that final question is why. When we're looking at academic problems, we usually ask who's having the problem, what's the problem, and the why, because the when and the where is typically classroom during specific instruction. So the who might be a large group of students. It could be a subgroup of students. It could be an individual student. The what, we want to be very specific on what the what is, and we want to operationally define that. We want to know when is it most likely to occur, where is it most likely to occur, and then the why. The why is something that I don't feel like we spend enough time on. And so we're going to spend some time today talking about root cause analysis. So root cause analysis is a process used to investigate and categorize the root cause of identified problem. The root cause is the highest level cause of a problem or the factor that should be permanently eliminated to see improvement. So root cause analysis gives teams the opportunity to look more deeply at identified challenges and investigate precursors that could be addressed to prevent the need from resurfacing. As with the weed, the challenge must be rooted out to prevent it from reappearing in the future. So in particular, root cause analysis helps identify system level factors related to identified needs. So that's one of the reasons we like to look at root cause analysis, because if it is something wrong with our system and we don't address it, we'll continue to have the same disparate outcomes over and over again. So that's why when we were talking about significant disproportionality, back when Melissa was talking, and we were talking about significant disproportionality in terms of special education, one of the first things that a team must do is engage in looking at the policies, practices, and procedures around Chapter 14 to make sure that there is not something systemically related to why there is disproportionality within a LEA. And that's why we wanted to spend some time thinking about root cause analysis. So I just want to jump to the Padlet really quickly to make sure that you see this. So in the second column of the Padlet, and Melissa, if you can put the link to the Padlet back in the chat in case someone navigated away from it. So in the Padlet, if you scroll down under identification of significant disproportionality, there are several documents. The first one is a document by NERN that focuses specifically on root cause analysis, and it includes these two formats, the fishbone and the 5 whys graphics. So it explains those within that document, but then under that, there is a fillable form. So we're going to be utilizing this fillable form for our activity. So if you are in the Padlet, and if you can go ahead and click on the root cause analysis fillable form, you see that there, and go ahead and either open it in a new window or just go ahead and download it. You're going to want to download it because you're going to want to use it when you get back to your LEAs. I'm saying back like we're at Patton. We're not just on Zoom. So go ahead and download that because you're going to be using this for our next activity. Okay, so make sure that if any of you are having issues with accessing the Padlet or downloading that material, just put that in the chat and Melissa or Dennis can help you out. Okay. So the first diagram on the left, this is the fishbone diagram. And the one on the right is the 5 whys. And they are two commonly used root cause analysis tools, which can be used by organizations or teams as a systematic and formalized approach to consider the root causes of an identified problem. So that's why earlier when you were looking at those data in the spreadsheet, you wanted you to identify a problem. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So the fishbone diagram helps teams explore all potential or real causes that result in the problem. So once all of the different categories have been populated and considered, the teams might choose to then use the 5 whys to drill down to the root cause, like even more. The 5 whys can be used individually or part of the fishbone. So if you think about this, the fishbone could be used first to identify, once you've identified that problem, to look at these various categories. And then you could use the 5 whys document to dig even deeper within one of those categories. Or you might say, you know, we're just going to focus on the 5 whys document, or we're just going to focus on the fishbone. So once again, these are just tools that can allow you to help guide the conversation as your team has identified a problem. You're thinking about root cause before you jump to this process of thinking about solutions. So before beginning the root cause analysis, it's important to convene your collaborative team. So this might be if you're implementing MTSS or PBIS, this might be your leadership team or your MTSS team that's looking at data on a regular basis. This might be a team at the cabinet level that's looking at data, or maybe you have a district level team that's been established. So before you begin root cause analysis, you're going to convene your collaborative team. All team members should participate in a data analysis session prior to completing the diagrams. So we should have identified what our problem behavior or what our problem is that we want to drill down with the RCA tools. And then the team should then decide whether they want to begin with the fishbone diagram to consider all potential causes for their identified need, or if they want to use that 5 whys tool. So looking a little more specifically at the fish diagram, and I want to make sure, okay, we have 30 minutes. Perfect. So at the head of the fish, where it says need, that's where you're putting your problem statement. So we start with the head of the fish, and then we kind of look at these various columns or these categories: context, resources, competency, and organization. So the fishbone diagram starts with the problem statement identified by your team's analysis of data, which is what you were doing earlier. And then the challenge is placed at the head of the fish. And then the backbone of the fish lists those factors that may be impacting that problem. So context includes those circumstances that might be impacting the identified need. So for example, maybe your school is in a rural community and there's lack of community partners, or there might be that may make it difficult to address the identified need. Context can also include broader systems such as the political climate, maybe your school board makeup, existing laws, policies, etc. So considering context. Resources include those assets within your organization that could be used to address the need. So for example, the team has identified that there's a lack of materials that are available, or the number of classes needed to support the student or type of classes needed aren't available, or that most valuable resource of time isn't available. Competency reflects the capacity to address the need. So remember earlier we were talking about, is there a need for professional learning? Are we just missing the skills that are necessary in order to address the identified need? And then finally, organizations. The organization may need to build their capacity. So this might be reviewing and revising policies and procedures to address that identified need. It might mean building critical partnerships with other organizations, or fundraising to support expansion of services, looking at budgets, etc. So as a team, you would consider these broad categories. And then as you are brainstorming by utilizing upward spiraling conversations, You're going to look for recurring themes across those factors, which factors have the most causes, and then think about next steps, thinking about prioritization, what changes might give us the most impact for that problem, thinking about your return on investment. And you could then consider, we have lots of issues with our organization. Maybe we need to engage in the 5 whys in order to drill down even further. So with the 5 whys, once again, begins with a problem statement. And if you are starting with the fish diagram, you might pull your problem statement from one of those categories. So for this example, the problem statement was identified during data analysis and one of the causes from the fishbone diagram. So the team will ask, why is this a need? Why is it present? And record responses, and just continue to ask why and record those responses as you go. So by asking why at least 5 times, your team should be able to get to the root cause for the identified need. So remember, these are just tools. It might be that you complete these, you might utilize these tools and feel like, I still think we need to dig deeper, and you can definitely do that. You continue to ask the questions, but we also don't want to be this root cause discussion to stymie progress either. We want to make sure that we're being reflective, but we don't want to be, engaged in root cause analysis for months without some sort of action. Because like someone in the chat said earlier, we don't want, or I think you used the example of professional learning to prevent us from moving forward with addressing the needs of our students. Okay, so we've gone over these 2 examples. You have the fillable form. In the Padlet, if you had questions about once you're in your small group and you are going through the process of thinking about root cause analysis, you can use this document from NERN. It does go through the process for you. Remember, you can just double click on that. And it will open up for you in a window, and you can scroll down, and it has some support for you if you need that in your small group. And just a reminder, and please, Melissa, tell me that the breakout rooms are still established.
I can't promise that everyone will be able to select join, but they are established and ready to go.
Okay, so it's 11:06 and we have till 11:30. So it says 10 minutes max, but I'm going to say let's do 15 minutes again. And I will look at the options to make sure that we can have 15 minutes for our breakout rooms. Thank you, Melissa. Wonderful. Make sure you have a timekeeper so you can kind of keep track of that time. You can type right into your fillable form if you like, and please have a spokesperson, because I want us to debrief about what did it feel like to engage in root cause analysis? What did it feel like to interact with the tools? I have to say we did this training before, and when I was in the breakout room, I purposely did downward spiraling conversations to give my group an opportunity to practice some of those skills. So if someone wants to practice a downward spiraling conversation, I wouldn't be mad at you. And so we will broadcast when you have just a minute remaining. Please remember those 4 agreements of courageous conversations as you're working in your group. So the activity is, if you want to, you can go back to that spreadsheet and pick one of those problems for the spreadsheet. But just as a reminder, the spreadsheet did, with the risk ratio, identify that our male students, our Black students, and our students who receive free and reduced lunch were more likely to be disciplined within our building. So you can pull your problem statement for that, focusing on all 3 of those groups or one of those groups. I think the highest group was free and reduced lunch. I think it was 4.566 was their risk ratio. So if you wanted to pull up that spreadsheet and look at those ratios again to identify a group to focus on, you can do that. And then You can choose to use the fishbone or the 5 whys document and just go through this process of root cause analysis for your group's problem statement. Okay, so before we move, are there questions? So the tools that you're using, the fillable form that you should have downloaded or opened from the Padlet. You can use your spreadsheet from the earlier activity, which is located on the Padlet. And then you're just going to be identifying a problem statement and then either working through the fishbone or the 5 whys, or if you're really snazzy and can do both in 15 minutes, that would be amazing. I don't see any questions, so I am going to pause the recording. And Melissa, if you want to put people in breakout. Look at me multitasking. So welcome back from our breakout rooms. Is there a group that would like to share out from their conversation? And I'm seeing someone from the chat who said they had a great conversation, so hopefully they will share.
So that was our group. Karen was in my group, and we used the 5 whys. We started there. We felt more comfortable with that. And looking at that problem statement, that group of individuals receiving a higher level of discipline. And we went through and our first, why could that be happening? We said system expects certain behaviors from a specific group rather than using a scientific approach to support proactive strategies to enhance desired outcomes. Might this be happening? Are building our own explicit bias that we're finding? Why might this be happening? We said school staffs, the culture in a building, or the systems that are currently in place. And we were having lots of discussion around all that. And that's kind of where we ended. So we didn't get to our next 2 whys.
Okay, but good conversation as a nice start to looking at that RCA. That's great. Someone else, please share about your conversation in your group, or what did it feel like to use the tools?
Not everybody at once. You have to go one at a time.
Well, I'll say with group 8, we talked a little bit of saying that it's not really exactly how you use the tool, but using it as a tool. So you can't really go wrong. So we identified like a problem, say that students in the category of free and reduced lunch received larger discipline, and the root cause maybe jumping around a little bit and saying maybe the discipline is happening in the morning. So maybe it's a hunger thing, and seeing that the kids may not have had access to breakfast. And so the behaviors might be exacerbated because they're hungry and not able to focus. Maybe they're coming to school late. Is there a problem with transportation? Maybe morning routine. Maybe the kids don't have an alarm clock. Maybe if we put grab and go lunches in the office when they're signing in late, they can grab food on their way through and then they have access to food. So we used it and had a lot of conversation around like possible causes of behavior issues. And we didn't really look at the larger school issue that maybe there's bias in there and there's that sort of thing. But we looked at a practical piece of maybe it's if we can help by making food available.
Yeah, so you thought within one category and thought about what are real-time things we can do to address this possible root cause for our students. Yes, Dennis, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So one of the things that we also want to think about when we're looking at this, so the group that was identified was the group that's free and reduced lunch, right? And that could encompass a number of other groups within that. So we might want to think about looking at intersectionality. So are we looking at students who are receiving free and reduced lunch who are also receiving special education services, students who are receiving free and reduced lunch who are also males? Like, what is really the group that is getting the most number of referrals? So it's great to start looking at it. So here's our starting point is free and reduced lunch, but that could encompass a whole multiple subgroups within that. And is there a subgroup within that group of free and reduced lunch that is also greatly disproportionate in receiving the outcomes that we're examining? So just keep that in mind as well. You might need to do a little bit more digging when we're talking about these subgroups.
That's a great point. And I don't know if any of you use Swiss, the Swiss system. That's wonderful for looking at discipline data, because it has so many filters that allows you to really drill down. So in Dennis's point, that's like the one thing they don't have is free and reduced lunch on Swiss as a filter, which irritates me. I'm going to suggest it, but they do have, I can even tell you, like, I don't know, like 100 filters that you could utilize to really disaggregate your data in terms of discipline, not just suspensions and expulsions, but also just looking at referral rate, major referrals and minor referrals. Thank you, Melissa, put in a demo for Swiss. We have 3 minutes left, and I want to be respectful of your time. One of the things we did not get to is I wanted to give you an opportunity to look at some resources, specifically the Equitable Practices Hub. So if you have not been there, you should definitely spend some time on the Equitable Practices Hub. It has a plethora of resources available. There's also PBIS's they have a technical assistance center. They have an equity work group, and they have developed a number of products that would be helpful on your journey. And then I also put this document, Advocating for LGBTQ Students with Disabilities, which I just thought was an amazing document to have as well. So those are some of the documents that are on the Padlet from the Equity Work Group, the Equitable Practices Hub. This is just a nice graphic from there that you could even print out and have that up in your building. I did want to mention our upcoming sessions. So we have a session on January 25th focused on data practices. So we started talking a little bit today, but we're going to talk specifically around using the TIPS data protocol and how that can enhance looking at your data. And we will be utilizing the root cause analysis for disproportionality document within that training. And then in March, on March 22nd, we will be looking at specifically at the strategy of identifying vulnerable decision points and creating neutralizing routines. So in the chat, Melissa is going to put the link to the survey for today. You need to complete that survey no later than November 8th. And that is how you're going to be able to access your credits for today. So utilize the survey and have that completed no later than November 8th, 2021, which is Monday. Yes, you will have access to the recording. So I'm going to put the recording on the Padlet. It's also going to be on the equity page of patent.net, and it will also be on YouTube as well. So you should be able to access in 3 ways. So I would probably look for that to possibly be uploaded next week. We'll have to do some editing, make sure the captions say what we want them to say, etc. Any other questions, comments? We'll hang around for a few minutes.